Welcome to the Real Estate Espresso Podcast, your morning shot of what's new in the world of real estate investing. I'm your host, Victor Minash. Last week, we talked about property taxes being reset when land changes hands. That's true, but it's not the whole story. One of our listeners, Steve, related a personal story, which I'm going to share here. He writes, Victor, your property tax episode struck home. My family owned what started as a landfill in 1969 in California. In the late 90s, it was full and a racetrack was built on it. The track builders signed a 25-year ground lease with extensions. Since the lease was this long, it was deemed an effective sale. Taxes went from $15,000 a year to over $200,000 a year, and years later, when we had to evict the tenants, we got stuck with the new amount. If the lease had been structured differently, it could have been avoided. Expensive family lessons learned by my dad and grandpa are branded into my memory. Well, yes, Steve, this is a nuance that I completely missed in my earlier episode. In some jurisdictions, a reassessment can be triggered even when the deed never changes hands. A long-term ground lease can do it. An assignment of the lease can do it. And at least in one important jurisdiction, California, a tenant default that terminates the lease can do it. And if you own property inside an entity, sometimes even a transfer of interest in the entity can also trigger a reassessment. The principle is simple. Property tax law in those jurisdictions is not always focused on who holds bare legal title. It's focused on who holds beneficial ownership, the economic control, or the right to use and enjoy the property. And that's why a ground lease can be treated as a sale for tax purposes, even though the dirt never moved from one owner to another. If the lease is not long enough, or if it carries purchase-like economics, a tax authority might say, that's close enough to ownership for us. California is the clearest example, and frankly the most important one for investors to understand, because Proposition 13, California's Board of Equalization, says a change in ownership includes the creation of a leasehold interest for 35 years or more, the transfer of a leasehold interest with 35 years or more remaining, and the termination of a leasehold interest that originally ran for 35 years or more. California also says that if the lessor sells the fee with the remaining lease under 35 years, that can trigger a reappraisal as well. And when a qualifying lease change occurs, the entire property subject to the lease is reappraised, including the leasehold and the leased fee interests. There's another California nuance that often catches people. If you started with a lease under 35 years and later extended it so its term crosses that 35-year threshold for the first time, that extension itself can be a change in ownership. So the reassessment trigger is not limited to the day the original lease was signed. It can happen later. And when an amendment or extension changes the economics in a way that looks like ownership. For an investor or developer, that means the legal team, the tax team, and the acquisitions team need to be all reading from the same playbook. California has yet another branch of this rule for tax-exempt land. The state's rule on taxable possessory interest says the creation, renewal, extension, sublease, or assignment of a taxable possessory interest in tax-exempt real property is generally a change in ownership. So if you're leasing from a city, a county, an airport authority, or any governmental owner, you're dealing with a separate body of tax logic. Investors sometimes assume that government land means simpler taxes. In this case, it means the exact opposite. Michigan is another jurisdiction where a long lease can trigger a reset, although the mechanics are framed as uncapping taxable value. Michigan's Treasury says a lease entered after December 31st, 1994 is a transfer of ownership if the lease term exceeds 35 years, including renewal options, or if the lessee has a bargain purchase option. If only part of the parcel is leased, only that part is uncapped. Michigan also says an assignment of a long lease can be a transfer of ownership if more than 35 years remain. And once a transfer occurs, the assessor must uncap taxable value for the following year. That is absolutely a material underwriting issue. South Carolina also deserves attention. Its code says real property is appraised at fair market value when an assessable transfer of interest occurs, and that includes a conveyance of lease if the total duration of the lease, including options, is more than 20 years, or if the lease grants a bargain purchase option. South Carolina also sweeps in transfers of more than 50% ownership in an entity over a 25-year period, and even the passage of 20 years since the last assessable transfer can trigger a change in ownership. So that's a reminder that reassessment triggers can sit within the lease, in the capital stack, or even in the ownership table. So what do you do with all this? First, stop thinking of property tax reassessment as a simple sale issue. It's a beneficial ownership issue. Second, review every single ground lease for total term, including extension options, bargain purchase options, assignment rights, default remedies, and what happens on forfeiture or merger of interest. Third, if the real estate sits inside an LLC, a partnership, a corporation, tracking changes in entity ownership just as carefully as you track deeds. Fourth, where the property sits on government land, don't assume the tax treatment is obvious. The big lesson is this: the risk does not only live in the purchase agreement, it lives in the lease, it lives in the operating agreement, it lives in the amendments, and sometimes it lives in default provisions. Good investors underwrite obvious numbers. Great investors underwrite the legal triggers that can change the numbers later. I want to thank you, Steve, for pointing out this nuance, and for the listeners at home, have an awesome rest of your day. Go make some great things happen. We'll talk to you again tomorrow.